do this. Thank you for providing feedback in the form of the surveys. Thank you for showing up in this session. Thank you for showing up on LinkedIn. I do not take that for granted because I know that there are many polls for all of us, and the fact that you're taking the time to pour into yourself, to pour into me, I want you to know that I appreciate it. So we are now on Module 2, and let's go ahead and take a look here. What I want to cover today is specifically some of the feedback from Module 1, ask you some questions around that, do a recap. I've brought a couple things from Module 1 forward into this module, so we can cover that and just have some feedback on that. And then we'll dive into Module 2 and then have Q&A. So that's the focus for today. As always, in any session that I teach, I like to say judgment-free zone. I want to create a safe space where we trust one another, and we get to stumble in here. If you can't stumble in here, where can you stumble? So, you know, no filter, bring it. And you know, if it lands incorrectly, say, wow, that was kind of weird for me. Just name it, but allow it to come so that we can learn together. Have empathy, which means that, you know, try to see different perspectives in the conversation. Stay in a space of learning. And I love that we're learning together, because the resources that you're sharing with me are super helpful, as well as with one another. You guys have got an A+ on Engage, so I don't need to say anything about that. And I hope that you will have some fun on this journey. So it won't be all heavy, but we'll be able to have fun together. Today we'll be talking about Module 2, best practices. Thank you, Brian, for your comment in the feedback about not just the individual or the organization best practices, but let's talk about both. So I've modified the presentation just a little bit, and we'll talk about that as well. Module 1, you filled out your survey. Thank you to everybody who's filled out the survey. You know, I wanted to understand terms that are important to you right now. When I teach, I realize that there are a lot of terms around diversity and inclusion. And you're not going to be quizzed on what does white fragility mean? What does unconscious bias? So I want definitions to be out there, but just as a resource, and we're all Google savvy, I'm imagining, so we can all look up a term in Google, but just, you know that there's a lot of terms. For me, white fragility, white privilege, once March, Aprilish hit, those became just out there, so much so that, you know, I'm looking for more information about the topic. And I think Brian and I were on a similar session where Robin DiAngelo, I think her name is DiAngelo, wrote the book on white fragility, which is sold out everywhere, but I think you can get it online version of it. But just so impactful. It just was not in my radar. Just like when you think about inclusion or diversity and the many different dimensions, let's say abilities. If you're not working in abilities or with people with physical abilities that you are up close with, it's easy for it to be in the background. But just be aware on this journey of building the muscle that one of the key things to do is to stay in a zone of learning. And so that's what we're doing today. Companies that are doing it right and companies that need help. I'm hoping that you are able to connect with your accountability partners and to have some conversations outside of this time together. I did get some feedback that perhaps we don't have enough time, and I wanted to ask the group about do we want to expand the time to 75 minutes or to 90 minutes? So you guys let me know what your thoughts are around expanding the learning time together. Since we're in Module 2, we've got a couple more, 4 more modules after this one. I want to know about the actions that you plan to take. The reason I'm asking you about the actions is that I want you to have an action plan when you leave this training. And I want you to remember what you did so that you can take that forward and continue to build on it in terms of having an action plan for continuing to build your inclusive leadership muscles. Any questions on this or comments? Okay. Is everybody able to connect with their accountability partners? Susan nod. Okay. All right. All right. We are going to move forward. According to diversity best practices, they do what's called an inclusion index snapshot, where they look at companies who are getting it right from a inclusion standpoint. Certainly there's Diversity Inc. and Diversity Best Practice, HRC, all these, Fortune, all these different surveys that are out there that are measuring companies who are doing it right around diversity and inclusion. But in this particular instance, I highlighted Diversity Best Practices because they have an inclusion index snapshot. Now, this is not as widely used, meaning, you know, when you think about something like the Diversity Inc. Top 50, I believe there's about 1,800 or so companies who participate in that survey. In this survey, there's under 200. So understand that everybody isn't clamoring to take this survey, and maybe because there's work to be done. But on this inclusion index snapshot, these companies have risen to the top in terms of getting it right when it comes to inclusion. They look at best practices around creating an inclusive culture, around recruitment and retention, around sharing their demographic data. And so you can see some companies here. When I deal with coaching clients, I'll tell them, you want to make sure that you're factoring in culture into your decision, because your experience is going to be impacted by the culture of the organization that you go to. And I'll point them to different surveys to really see which companies are being recognized for getting it right in the space. Let me say this, although there are companies that are getting it right, all of us are on this journey. And so even though there may be a company on a list, there may still be some dirty data. I'm going to quote Janice, Brian. I like that title, Dirty Diversity. You know, there's some dirt still there. You know, everybody doesn't have their closet together. Let me say that. So, but I want to recognize companies like, you know, Accenture, General Motors. They actually pivoted quite quickly around the Black Lives Matter, and the CEO is actually, they've created an inclusion council, and the CEO is chairing that council. That's important to note because there are many companies with chief diversity officers or HR teams where there's a layer to get to the CEO. And so I like to recognize when CEOs are like, okay, I'm getting involved here, i.e. the CEO Action Committee, where many CEOs are a part of that. I think it's around 500 or so who have joined that action committee, and they actually do have Black Lives Matter as a focus, or dismantling racism as a focus for that group. So you tell me, what did you find? One of the questions I asked you last week was to see what companies you thought were doing it right and who needed some help. So here's where I pause and get some feedback from you on who's doing it right and who needs some help. Anybody find anything?
I went to two sources, Googling away myself, and Stryker Corporation came up, which didn't come up for you. Accenture did come up for me, and also Cisco were doing well. One that made me a little sad was to find out that PVH Corporation wasn't doing well, because that's Calvin Klein, Hilfiger, Jeffrey Bean, and those might be some, you know, TJ Maxx finds that I like a lot. And I was disappointed to hear that I'll be reconsidering that support a little bit.
Yeah, it's amazing how we are now shifting our buying power. As a matter of fact, next week, July 7th, I believe, is a blackout day in terms of using your spending dollars just for Black-owned companies. So there's going to be a lot of focus around that next week. But I'm interested in hearing what you found about Stryker Corporation, because last year I spoke at Stryker Corporation. So tell me what you found.
It came up in Investopedia, and it was just a list of who was good and who wasn't. So I didn't frankly go deeply into their criteria. I
Okay.
just was like, that's interesting. And then I went to Forbes was the other one that I looked at.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for
So I
that.
don't know why they thought they weren't.
I will do some digging. I'll do some digging because I know the chief CIO at that organization as well. So just curious. Ben and Jerry's.
Oh, they came in as best. Maybe I was unclear. They were one of the top corporations.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
No, I'm not trying to prove you wrong. I just want to know what
Oh,
they've
no,
done.
Oh, you're wondering what their practices are. I follow.
Yeah. I just want to see, what they're doing different in this space. Right. Ben and
Mhm.
Jerry's has gotten a lot of kudos for what they are doing. They have statements on their website, and before they put out their statement, they had been doing the work in the background, because again, any statements coming out are being scrutinized to validate whether or not it actually matches up with the walk and the talk. So Ben and Jerry's is, up there in the space, respected and recognized for the work that they're doing around fighting racism and just being inclusive in general. Anyone else?
I think for the worst companies, one that actually came up was Berkshire Hathaway. And I'm not the one who found that. Actually, Lance was the one who found that. But it just made me think about industries where you're required to kind of have your own base of clientele and people that you know, and word of mouth kind of referrals and things like that, and how that's probably a really tricky industry to break into, maybe as a person of color or another different minority group. I feel like it's heavily dominated by, white men. And so that just like got me thinking kind of about all those other kind of like business models that operate on those kind of connections, and how they can be difficult to navigate.
Now, is that one Warren Buffett?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of different arms to it, but they have a big real estate piece.
Yeah, Warren Buffett was in the news, I would say in the last couple months, just about his viewpoint on diversity and inclusion. So if I'm not mistaken, he believes it's good for other companies, just not for his company. So there was a lot of, I don't know if anybody's seen that, but there was a lot of backlash to that. Yeah, great. Brian, you're raising your hand. What do you have to say?
Well, I'm just laughing at this idea, and I just saw a parody. It was a sidebar, but kind of related to the point, is that somebody who does parodies of famous Broadway song tunes, Randy Rainbow, I don't know if anybody else has seen, I think it pops up occasionally in my Facebook feed, but he was basically trying to encourage President Trump to wear a face mask, right? Like cover your face, and he does a whole tune. But my point in that context and why my brain went there is like this idea of what you just said. It was more of a, where people think, oh, it's a good thing for other companies, but it's not a good thing for me. Like President Trump will stand there and say, well, wearing a face mask is good for people, but I'm not going to do it. It's like, so yeah. It's more of a soapbox moment, but I just find if we're talking about leadership, right, it's sort of that old adage of do what I say, not what I do, and always being role models, and our acts, courageous ones, are the ones that are setting the tone in the communities we're in, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, it's interesting. On the companies getting it right, I mean, I spoke with Sarah about this during our touch base, but I've previously worked at MasterCard, and I know you mentioned the diversity in top 50, and I think in 2020 they were the #6 company, and they are definitely you know, investing and making progress. And I don't know, Simone, if you'd seen this, I can post it for the group in LinkedIn, but you know, first they made their solidarity statement with Black Lives Matter, and then they took a pause to do some inventory, and then they published what their plan is, and they set time bound in some cases, I think for 2025, to where they'll be. And so it shows that idea of it's words, but then there's like a very concrete action plan about the policies, the programs, and the activities that they're going to do. And again, I think that's true corporate leadership, but also mindful. You know, you mentioned 1,800 companies or 200 companies. It's like everybody's on a journey, and there's always the dirt, even when there's still progress, right? So and that's what I've been struggling with, you know, in this broader context of the sort of polarities that we're in right now. And I appreciate you creating this safe space, because I hear, don't do performative acts, and then, but then at the same time, it's like, be in action.
Yeah.
And then it's sort of like center Black and brown voices, and then it's don't lean on people of color to educate you. Yeah, it's sort of like, I'm trying to reconcile. Anyway, I know it's a little off topic on companies, but I think that's what companies wrestle with when they're trying to make progress.
Yes,
I think
yes.
we all are wrestling with that as we try to make progress.
What's that, Lanta?
I said, I think we're all wrestling with that as we try to make progress. I think that's pretty universal experience right now.
Yeah, what astute observations, because it's so true. And I see it on some social media posts about, you know, or comments about, you know, people having to do the work. But, you know, let's face it, that everybody's not in that space of constant learning and wanting, and everybody didn't like school. So now you're saying read all this material to get up to speed and not ask. And some people are more, let me ask so I can learn that way. Let me consume that way. And there is a challenge. Absolutely. So I love to tell people to give themselves grace. I think about, I think his name is Russell Brunson for ClickFunnels, the site. He made an attempt and put a video out there about what his company was going to do in response to Black Lives Matter. And he just got, I don't want to say decimated, but there was a lot of backlash around it, because his thought was, hey, I didn't know racism existed. And wow, I can't believe that's happening in 2020. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to create a documentary, and I'm going to get people to tell their stories, and I'm going to put $250,000 up for this. And there were people who canceled their ClickFunnels account. And so I was reading and I was like, okay, I mean, I think everybody doesn't know what to do. And so when someone tries to say that they're going to do something, again, back to what Jennifer Brown was saying about calling in versus calling out, I think if you get it wrong, you can talk to a person like, hey, I'm not sure if that's going to work. Maybe you want to get together a team and let's think about this a bit differently. I remember when I worked for a consumer goods company, they had a multicultural marketing advisory group. And what that group was charged with was making sure that the company didn't put their foot in their mouth before putting out marketing, because many companies have done that. And you're like, did anybody see this before this went out? So they would have this group mixed with diversity, but and marketing experts who were looking at the content and sort of being gatekeepers before it was rolled out. So thank you for sharing that. The point is that many people need help on this journey, And some are doing it well, and some others are challenged. Even those that are doing well, they still have a lot of work to do based on what's happening in the world. Let me move forward to what I believe are inclusive behaviors. And I appreciate the Deloitte study that you shared, Brian, which I think is a great resource going forward. That will be shared as well with this group. But in my mind, you have to meet judgment with curiosity, because we're going off of what we have learned, what our experiences are, and saying, yes, this is right, or no, this is not right, based on what we're taught. And so for me, there's this, you have to be willing to unlearn. I'm originally from Jamaica. And so for me, I identify more as a Jamaican first. But when you see me, you see a Black woman. So you may be treating me based on your interactions and experiences with Black women or Black people. But I come with an additional layer of complexity from the Caribbean. So you have to be willing to learn about different cultures. And I think in that survey, it talks about cultural competency as well as one of the skills or knowledge to have. You have to be willing to up your stake or understanding about cultural competency. And you have to be willing to unlearn or acknowledge that, you know what, everything I learned is not true. Even though it may seem like it is, it's not necessarily true. And I struggle with that with some of the things my mom taught me growing up, that now it's like, I say, you can't say that, like, you know, so you have to be willing to unlearn and learn. And that is a true skill in this inclusive leadership area. You have to be willing to be self-aware, like, you know, check yourself, see how you're showing up, and be able to call yourself on stuff. It doesn't have to be someone else telling you, hey, that didn't land so well, or that wasn't very inclusive. And I've asked people when I do training, how many of you have ever felt excluded? Since it's a small group, raise your hand if you have ever felt excluded. Just 2 people. Okay, I have definitely, yes. Oh, no, Brian's got 2. All right. Yeah, it doesn't feel so good when you feel excluded. So we want to work on building those muscles in terms of being inclusive. I've got integrity up there because I think you need to walk your talk. You can't say you're doing one thing. So let's say you work in HR and your job is XYZ. And so the organization has a D&I strategy and you're trained to do XYZ and be inclusive, and you're practicing that way. But when you walk out the door, you turn into a different person and you're not as inclusive. You have to marry the two so that you are in fact inclusive inside the organization and outside the organization. Now, who's teaching you to be inclusive outside of the organization? I like to think that's what this training is about. You are working on yourself so that you can meet the organization with the work that they're doing on their end. And these skills will help you. I think you need to be a risk taker. What I mean by this is that you need to bet on people. It may not always come in the nice package that you want. And I know you were talking about this somewhat last week, Sarah, with Dress for Success and how the women show up. And so just because someone shows up, you know, wearing a hoodie or just not neatly coiffed and in the package that you want them to be in does not mean that they're not worthy of opportunity. And so again, it's challenging yourself to bet on talent, take a risk, because I always say to organizations, if you take a risk and you hire somebody or promote someone from the employee resource group space, you give them an opportunity to lead. If they're not up to par, it doesn't mean that you can't have a conversation with them. You can't train them to show up differently, but give them an opportunity. I get a little twisty about ERGs or business resource groups not getting opportunity and not being looked at as a talent source. I want more companies to do that. And of course, there's the allyship or being supportive, being an advocate and champion of others. These are some inclusive behaviors that I think it's important to master.
So Brian and I were talking a little bit about advocate versus ally versus, what was the other? Accomplice.
Oh.
That, you know,
Oh,
the
please.
accomplice word is coming out more and more, and the connotation that that has. And, you know, both of us kind of feel like we can't call ourselves advocates or allies. Like, we want to be named that and not just self-define as an ally or an advocate, because that just shows so much privilege too. It's like, who defines that, whether you're an ally or an advocate. And I think they're, you know, it's, I mean, I remember hearing a long time ago in, you know, a social justice space, don't call yourself an ally. Wait until someone calls you an ally, because that's kind of the proof in the pudding that you're doing the work. So I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting to me. You know, I may not get it right either with what I'm about to say, but let me say this. I struggle with that as well, because it's like, who defines that you're an expert? So, okay, because I'm in Forbes, or because I'm on TV, or because then I'm defined as an expert. Who calls me, who gives me the title expert? I'm saying to myself, well, I'm an expert based on the fact that X, Y, Z. So I'm still learning and embracing what I heard last week on the panel discussion. And I think the bottom line is, if you're going to call yourself an ally, and you have to act like an ally, which means that you are not the silent ally. You're going to have to take some risk and use your voice and influence to create change.
May I build on that a little bit?
Yes, please.
I took an interesting webinar last week called Break the Chains with Janine Staples.
Mm-hmm.
And she was talking about the purpose here was the capacity to hold pain, and this kind of, she had this very specific triangulation of just harshness that people of color have experienced in the world. And if you can't face into that and hold space for that, then you aren't reliable, trustworthy, responsible to step forward in leadership in this community. That you have got to be able to have this capacity to witness and hold the ugly a little bit in terms of the experience, or maybe that person who shows up in the hoodie, or maybe the person who doesn't show up in the way you want them to. And let there be an emotional justice too, where you're acknowledging their interior as opposed to their exterior. And it really got me thinking about what it takes to be an ally. And I agree it's action, but it also requires an unflinching, you know, stepping away from that fragility, if you will, like to be unflinching in your ability to witness. Like, I can't change your experience. But I can bear witness to it and honor that experience, and then offer support where I'm able to. But yeah, that idea of responsibility in the way you show up and being reliable was really important to me. It really struck home. To be more than words.
Yeah. If you have a replay for that, please post it in the group. I know sometimes they send out replays. Please post it in the LinkedIn community for this group to see as well. Any other thoughts? Inclusive terminology. Here's some terms that I had put together for you in module 1. I brought them forward into this module, but just really some of the terms, no matter where I go or where I teach diversity and inclusion, we always talk about what the definitions are, because people have different definitions of what they think diversity is, or what inclusion is, and you know, equality. You're hearing a lot about DEI. So these terms are in here as well. I mentioned earlier white privilege, white fragility, and boy, are there many, many examples. I mean, you can just look for hashtags to find examples of these different things that are going on. And we just talked about ally, unconscious bias. There are some people that are saying that companies who are just focused on unconscious bias training, they don't get it, and that there's more work past unconscious bias. Last year, I did a bit of work around conscious inclusion, where you consciously choose to be inclusive. And I really liked the work that I was doing with that last year. So when we think about diversity, what do you think of when you hear diversity? Tell me, in terms of definition, what do you think of when you hear diversity? For me, I think of differences, lots of differences. And so what you see on this page here is that there's a diversity dimension, and something that was created by Marilyn Loden. And there's primary diversity and secondary diversity. When people think about diversity, they primarily think about race, gender, physical abilities, sexual orientation, and maybe that's it. But there's a lot more to it when it comes to diversity. If you take a look here in terms of secondary, you may geographic location, your educational background, your parental status, whether I'm a parent or not, my religious beliefs, my work experiences, and it goes on and on. So what I want you to take from the definition of diversity is that it is a lot more complex than it seems. I do love how Verna Myers, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Netflix, she says, diversity is being invited to the dance. And you hear a lot around corporations saying they need to diversify the talent, but inclusion is asking someone to dance. And that just has stayed with me for years. I hear it quoted so many times, but it's just so simple and beautiful about what it is. And you can have one without the other.
Two thoughts, I'll chime in. One, to build on that, and Verna was also credited with the first two phases, the being invited to the dance, being asked to dance. I can't remember who took it one step further, but it was a panelist in one of these recent forums, and she said, and the equity piece is around having the right shoes that are comfortable enough to actually perform in the dance.
Love that.
So it's and then the other thing that this slide that you have up right now made me think of, and Jennifer Brown talks about this, and I've seen it with other practitioners, is this iceberg visual where these primary characteristics are above the line, the secondary are below the line, and sometimes it's also in a bullseye graphic. But Jennifer speaks a lot about this idea, and in the spirit of inclusive leadership, the notion that where is there psychological safety where people are willingly lowering their waterline to expose more dimensions or aspects of themselves. So, and I think your comment around what are inclusive leadership is like that self-awareness, and then how do we show up to enable that? People are only going to reveal what they feel safe to reveal, you know, and looking at the list here, you know, differently abled or some type of physical or mental ability is something that, you know, often will be masked, right? Because of it's taken a long time for, even in broad strokes, it to be normalized as something that people feel safe to reveal. So anyway, those are just two thoughts I had. But yeah, the shoe thing stuck with me because I was like, yeah, not everybody has shoes. Not everybody has good fitting shoes. Not every, you know, it's like. Yeah.
I love it. I'm going to skip ahead to a slide which you brought up when I presented earlier, just around the equity one. And I've included that here, but I love that. I'm going to make a modification and bring in the iceberg. I think it's a great build. Yeah, I mean, I think even sexual orientation, I mean, I think there's still some stigma and stigma around mental ability, you know, where people hide. If I need a therapist or that additional support, based on what is thought about that, I may mask that. So here's the slide, Brian. And so this slide is talking about equality versus equity. And so do we be fair and give everyone the same opportunity, the picture on the left? Or do we provide some extra support for people who need the extra support? And I think it's a beautiful image. So I love what you said about the shoes. The term inclusion means to be included, and the church has changed, you know, in my lifetime. And based on what I see here, this is just an example of this Methodist church who is saying everybody is welcome to the church. But that's not the case for all churches, let me say. But there are some that are more inclusive than others. But the idea of being inclusive is being welcoming of others. And I think about, again, inclusion is the opposite of exclusion. We talked about allyship. Racism is front and center right now in the diversity and inclusion world. There is much work to be done, so much work. And you're being asked, not just individually, but as organizations, to choose a side. You can't choose the quiet side because your narrative will be crafted for you. It'll be assumed. So you're being asked to choose if you're a racist or not a racist. And to show up, and I'll use the term ally, to show up as an ally is maybe this doesn't impact you, but yes, it does. So I have been writing articles about finding your voice. And I've had people tell me, I'm an introvert. This is just not my thing to speak up about this. But I think you have to make a decision. Even if you're an introvert, you have to make a decision with what your stance is. So if you're going to have a one-off conversation with someone about it, be clear on where you stand on this issue and know that people are wanting to know, where do you stand? And you may have to do some championing or explaining. I have an article that I'll post in the group because I had someone say to me, when I try to have a conversation with my family, they're more focused on the looting that's going on than the fact that lives are lost. You know, and people are noticing from a social media standpoint, if you stay silent and you don't comment at all on Black Lives Matter or racism and the unjustness of what's going on, and you're posting about, look, they destroyed the statue or destroyed the Target, that narrative is a narrative that's saying which side you're on. So you just need to be mindful that you may want to stay out of the fray, and I get that, but staying out of the fray means that people are coming up with a narrative for you that this is where you stand, and it might not be true. I think, you know, unconscious bias is, again, what we unconsciously do. It's based on data that we have in our brain, life experiences, you know, what we're taught. How many seconds do you think it makes to make a decision about someone? Anyone? In the first how many seconds? 2. What else? It's actually the first 7 seconds, you decide what you think about the person in front of you. In the first 7 seconds. Now that may, whatever you think negatively or positively, may or may not be true. I'll post this video in the LinkedIn group for you to watch this video on unconscious bias. I think you have to have a conversation with yourself that, hey, okay, stop. I acknowledge what my brain is telling me, but there may be another explanation. So before I rush to judgment, let me just stop. And I could check by asking the person a question to validate whether or not that's true, or I could go about finding some research to support the opposite. There are strategies and tactics that you can use to offset those biases that immediately come up for you. So how do you think some of these terms impact how you are as a leader?
I'll jump in while others might be thinking. I guess I think about values in the sense of, what do you stand for? What are you committed to? And then how do these terms, like, again, trying to keep some of those that might feel a little bit more charged or mysterious or challenging, is like the idea of the curiosity, right? Like a leader's job in a way is to examine things and to have some level of, openness and neutrality. And so, but there's also the discomfort, right? Especially when people haven't, faced some of these before. And one of the other words that Sarah and I chatted about, which, 3 short months ago, I had a problem with the vernacular of white supremacy because I so directly associated that with more heinous, violent, aggressive acts. And yet, when you kind of think about it in a more neutral way, it's the condition of being white, and supremacy, or like the reigning principle of white is the standard or the normal or the, the desired. So white supremacy is the wrapper that society lives in, not necessarily only those outrageous acts. So back to, it's like this idea of, like, as a leader, I had to like sit with that discomfort. I had to get curious. I had to do those Google searches. I had to talk to people and pressure test my thinking. And, and then it's in chapter 2 of Robin DiAngelo's book. And, so it's like, now I'm much more, 3 short months later, I'm an evolving leader that now has a different relationship with the concept of white supremacy, so it's, but, but then if I'm also responsible for the contributions and the actions and the performance of others, it's like I need to be creating spaces where people can show up, be on that exploration journey, and so that's why it's hard work.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. It is hard work, really hard work. Yeah.
And I think part of it too is, how do you balance, creating a safe space for people who may have felt prejudices versus creating a space where it's okay to learn and to grow without kind of offending anybody else. Because it's one thing to say that you're learning and be active in educating yourself about, your white privilege or whatever, but it's also, you also have to make sure as a supervisor or as a leader that you're creating a safe space for everybody, no matter what. So how, like, balancing those two things, if you have one Black person in your office, like, not relying on them every single time to be that voice of the other, almost, of that diverse voice that sometimes that we lean to just to check that box, but like actively recruiting and hiring people from diverse backgrounds, and not relying on them to be the ones to teach you in a work setting. It's one thing outside of work to ask your friends who are okay with it, but we can't rely on maybe the one person we have in our office to be our teacher. We need to go out and make sure that we're doing it ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I heard someone the other day saying, strive to make it more than just that one person, right? So that they don't feel so alone And I think you were answering your own question in your comment with what you were saying about recruitment and retention, and not, you know, in terms of how to treat that person so they don't feel overwhelmed. So I think that the bottom line is that you're going to have to pick up new skills as a leader to survive in this time, in this space. And I think that some leaders have gotten away with allowing others to have these skills. And what we're experiencing right now, everybody is having to shift who they are as leaders. So when you think about the inclusive lens from an individual standpoint, I offer some areas for you to check, okay? Check your family. Is there any diversity in your family? The makeup of families are very different today. What about where you work? You actually have a choice where you work. I'm a mother, and I had to make a choice to move my daughter from a daycare because the diversity at the daycare, she was the only one. And we managed with it for a while, but it was really hard. Hard from the sense of engagement with the parents outside of the school setting. So I talked before about integrity and you know, being inclusive when you're in the workplace and then changing when you're out. We found that outside of the school setting, there wasn't that welcoming embrace. And we wanted her to grow up with seeing teachers that look like her. And now I don't mean that all the teachers need to be Black, but there needs to be one, at least one or two, so she can see that. So I think when you think about the place that you work, you know, you can't change your family, or maybe you can somewhat, but when you think about the place you work, you can be intentional in saying, you know what, I think that I will thrive more in a more inclusive environment. Where do you travel to? Is there diversity in your travel plans? Where do you eat? Do you eat at the same place all the time? Is there an opportunity to visit different cultures? Brian, I took Brian to a Jamaican restaurant once, remember? You know, so you can experience from a cultural standpoint different cuisines, and you can not just enjoy the food, but you can ask questions about the culture from the people that are there. That's an opportunity to expose yourself to different diversity. And friends, you know, I hear people saying I have one Black friend, or I don't have any Black friends. You can have more friends. I have found with the Corona time, I have made so many friends on social media, it's not funny. I only know them through social media, whether it's on LinkedIn or Twitter or even Instagram, but we've built up this rapport just from talking to one another. And so, you know, if you live, I had someone say to me, I live in Indiana, and, you know, there's not a lot of diversity, but you could still make friends. You know, in this day of technology, you can still make diverse friends. You can diversify your network, your friendship base, you can. And of course, there are social media groups that you can get engaged in, even church. You saw that sign that I posted about the church. Think about where your place of worship. What's missing from this list? What else can you do as an individual to build that inclusive leadership muscle? Well, think about it over
Stores
homework.
that you shop at, you know,
Yes,
like
yes,
local.
yes, where you shop. I love that. I think it was Lanta who was saying before, just being disappointed about places that you shop, because now you're becoming aware. And so you may change where you shop based on where they stand, you know? From an organization standpoint, Brian, you mentioned values before. I think it's very important to look at the organization values. Also look at the leadership. What does the leadership team look like? Is there board diversity? Recruitment, retention, marketing, who are the suppliers that they work with? It could even be who are the foundations that they donate their money to, community outreach. It's so many different things and signals on whether organizations are walking the talk when it comes to inclusion. There's a huge opportunity here. I like to equate this to the gym. When you go to the gym and you want to build a muscle, what matters? What I am consuming, so drinking, eating. So what are you consuming in terms of inclusion? Check what you're consuming, because that's going to impact the muscle. How often are you going? Frequency. How often are you building your inclusion muscles? Consistency. Who are the key partners that you have? And of course, they say you want to celebrate, because as was mentioned before, this is hard work and it's a journey. Sometimes you're going to get it right and sometimes you're not. But give yourself grace and start again.
If only my inclusion muscles resulted in my physical muscles, I would be in amazing shape.
Nice. Well, you got to do the work and it'll be the same. Wait, so I've got to ask, are you doing the same work that you do for your physical muscles as you do for your inclusion muscles?
No.
Okay, well, there's your answer.
Yeah, you're right. That's what I'm saying. It's like, yeah, it's always easier to do another Zoom call than it is to get on the treadmill.
That's so funny.
Indeed.
I'm kind of excited looking at that list. I just have to say, I felt a little intimidated last week. You know, I own a yoga studio and you guys are all in major corporations and doing like big HR and some neat stuff. And yet I was going, I'm like, I am consuming, and I am like, I've made this deal with myself to post. I'm like leading my followers to have a sense of you know, knowing bias, learning terms, and I make a deal with myself to post a certain number of posts every single day. I know posts aren't everything, but it's a start. It's consistent. I've already partnered to have a workshop for people to write and process how they feel about social injustice and racism. And so I'm like, yeah, I hit consistency, I hit partnership, and I always have a glass of champagne. So I'm like, all right, I'm doing okay. It's a little world view, but thank you for that list, because I feel a little more like I have a right to be here. So thank you for that.
Well, let me just say, you had a right to be here last week as well. So,
My own crap, right? So thank
yeah,
you.
we have saboteurs that are telling us whether we're worthy or whether we should be included at the table. So I think it might be an assumption where everybody is in their career. But, you know, our minds tell us these things, and we've got to check to make sure that it's actually true. So you are welcomed here. You were welcomed last week, and yay. Yay. Sarah, you were very quiet today. Everything okay on your end?
Busy work day. It all came colliding together on Tuesday. So, but yeah, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So thank you. Best practices for an inclusive organization. They need to not just do one-off diversity training. It cannot be a compliance-based diversity training or diversity training once a year. It need, you know, we just looked at that slide about building your muscle. If you are training your employees and you give them 1 cup of tea for the whole year, or 1 smoothie for the workout, how do you expect them to be inclusive? How do you expect them to know how to do it? Most people aren't going out of the workplace and saying, okay, let me learn how to be inclusive so I could do a better job of being inclusive in the organization. They're just not. So I advise organizations to provide continual learning opportunities for diversity and inclusion education. Leverage focus groups. On the panel discussion we had earlier this week, or was that last week? They mentioned listening sessions, that organizations are having listening sessions to understand courageously what employees are feeling. So courageous conversations about this topic. And so that is an opportunity to leverage your employees as an internal focus group, not just the ERGs, employee resource groups or business resource groups, but to leverage your employee base to get some learning from them. Supplier diversity is a huge opportunity in the diversity and inclusion equation. Who are the vendors that you work with? There is an opportunity for you to broaden your reach and be more inclusive in that space. Benchmark from industry leaders. A lot of people were taking feedback from the Diversity Inc. Top 50 and different surveys. There are tons of information out there. NICS exclusive language. Once when I taught diversity and inclusion and I said, raise your hand if you feel excluded, someone came up to me afterwards and said, oh my God, I'm so glad you said that. And it's someone who you wouldn't even think would feel that. But she then shared with me that she was a remote worker, and pre-COVID, whenever she came into the office, someone would make a comment, what are you doing here? And so she started to feel self-conscious about showing up in the office. She didn't feel like she belonged there. So just check exclusive language, whether it's in job descriptions or language in general. Do a sense check of your employees to see if they feel included or excluded. You can think about engagement surveys, etc., but there may be something there to work with. We are going to be talking about recruitment and retention, doing a deep dive with that in one of these modules, as well as technology that can be leveraged to support your inclusion goals. We talked about taking a risk. Bet on your talent, bet on your ERGs, bet on somebody. I attended a session on Friday, and the conversation was about organizations rewarding people who have produced the work or have the accomplishments as opposed to potential, that there is an opportunity to reward potential. So I would say, as a best practice, betting on your talent is a good thing to do. And of course, walking the talk, walk in integrity. The bottom line is that we all want to feel welcomed and included. So as a next step, what I want you to do is what you have been doing, showing up to these sessions, engaging, connecting with your accountability partner for a conversation. Fill out your module survey, please, and get that to me by Saturday. This time, I want you to look for best practice behaviors in your environment. How are you seeing best practices showing up? And maybe there are best practices that we didn't discuss that you want to bring to the next call, but take a look at that. And as always, look at what is the action that you are planning on taking. Questions? Two things. One of the feedback comments was that we needed more time. What do you think about the 1 hour, or do you think we should be doing 1 hour and 15 minutes or 1.5 hours for this session?
I could move to 90 minutes next week.
Yeah, I actually have a conflict today, but generally I can be flexible with my time, but I do have to jump off today.
Okay.
So thank you. But yeah, whatever the group consensus is fine with me.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I'm the same. I can make it work.
Okay. So maybe I'll send out the email and then we'll shift so that there's more dialogue with us and not just running through the material. The learning for me last week was to cut down on the amount that I put in there. There's obviously a lot more detail that we can get into, but I want to be able to get through the material. So we'll plan for next week for 1.5 hours, see how that goes, and then tweak accordingly. I'll do that. Any questions on what I'm asking you to do? Oh, and another thing, I am going to send you a recap. So I'll send the recording and I'll send you the slides.
Thank you. That sounds great.
Okay, well, we did great today with time and engagement. I'm having a great time still. Thank you so much for taking this journey and learning and talking your truth, sharing your truth in this space. I really appreciate it. Okay, have a good week, everybody.
Thanks so
Have a
much.
good vacation, Lanta.
I'll be thinking of you all.
Pictures, post a picture in the group so we can be jealous.
All right.
Celebrate with you.
So much.
Take care.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.